Hi everyone, let's give it a shot at analyzing this graph. This graph represents the cardiac cycle, and as you can see, the blue line stands for the left atrium cycle, and the aorta is the red one, the left ventricle is the black one. And now we're trying to know how these graphs represent the cardiac cycle. Well, this is a representation of the pressure going on inside the heart during the three phases: atrial systole, ventricular systole, and diastole. They come in this order, which I most of the time call it Dave. Diastole comes, then atrial systole, and ventricular systole. But what do these points mean here in the graph? A, B, C, D, and E. Well, as we said, it represents the pressure, and at those points where the curves cross each other, this is where the valves open and close. The valves open and close. So that was just a quick analysis of the whole general main point. About point A, here, as at this low curve, it was very low at zero. So at zero pressure, we were in diastole. So this was the end of diastole, as we're starting the atrial systole, where it starts to rise. As you can see, it starts to rise a little bit, a small curve of rising. This means we're in the atrial systole. Then when it has a huge exponential rising curve, this is the ventricular systole. And the same happens with the atria, like in the aorta here. With the aorta, it starts to increase, then beginning to decrease in the diastole. Okay, here also, it starts to decrease, then it rises again. Okay, this is the diastole going on. So at point A, this was the end of diastole. And we know in diastole, the AV valve is open. The atrium has filled with blood during the preceding diastole, the previous one. In this diastole, in this region of the graph, the atria was filled with blood. The atrium. So the pressure gets higher in the atrium than the ventricle, so the AV valve is open to allow blood to flow from the atria to the ventricle. And this leads us to the atrial systole. Between points A and B, this is where the atrial systole happens. The left atrium, we're here, by the way, talking about mainly the left atrium and left ventricle and the aorta, of course. We wouldn't be talking about aorta if it wasn't for the left side of the heart. So between the points A and B, where the atrial systole occurs, the left atrium contracts, that's for sure, and increasing the atrial pressure and forcing blood. So the AV valve is still open, as the pressure is higher in the atrium than in the ventricle. There's this pressure gradient. Okay? And the ventricular pressure increases slightly as it fills with blood. You know, the blood is flowing from the atria to the ventricles, about the left part. So as time moves on, the ventricles have a higher pressure. The pressure increases slightly as more blood is filled through it. And the pressure, of course, was higher in the atrium than the ventricle, so the AV valve is open. In point B here, that's the beginning of the ventricular systole. By the ventricular systole, we have to mention that the left ventricle contracts and the AV valve shuts. The pressure in the left atrium drops as the muscle relaxes, and the pressure in the ventricle exceeds the pressure in the atrium. So that's what makes the AV valve shut to leave the aortic valve to open. And that's what we're discussing here at point C in the ventricular systole. As you can see here, this was also an intersection between the aorta curve and the left ventricle curve. and they intersected together. This means the blood flowed from the ventricle to the aorta. There's this intersection between them. So as we can see, the ventricle continues to contract. We're still in the systole part, the contraction part, aka the pressure in the left ventricle exceeds than in the aorta as it's contracting more, and the aortic valve opens. The blood is going to move from the ventricle now to the aorta to reach all the body and all the story we all know. So the blood is forced into the aorta. The blood is forced and it moves to the aorta to all the body, and then we're moving and reaching point D. D is the intersection of the left ventricle and the aorta again, and the beginning of diastole. When they intersect again, the aorta curve and the left ventricle become at the same pressure. Like here, this indicates the start of diastole, and as we know, this is diastole part, as this was the atrial systole, the ventricular systole, and this is the diastole relaxation. So this is the diastole part getting to start, where the left ventricle has been emptied of blood. Here was the journey of emptying the left ventricle to fill up the aorta. But now it's all emptied up, and we have the diastole here getting to start because the ventricle is all emptied. So as we can see here, the left ventricle has been emptied of blood and the muscles in the left ventricle relaxed. It's diastole, aka relaxation part, and the pressure falls below that in the newly filled aorta. The aorta now has a higher pressure, and the aortic valve is going to close at the beginning of diastole. We know it's open there. Between points D and E now is during diastole, the early diastole phase actually, where the ventricle remains relaxed. We're in the diastole, the ventricle remains relaxed, but some blood is flowing into the relaxed atrium. Can you see what's going on here? Like, did you get this part? How now we're getting all over again with the atrium. As we started with the atrium contracting, now the atrium is having blood flowing into it from the pulmonary vein, straight from the lungs, causing an increase in pressure. This indicates that the atrial systole is starting in a moment, like not in a moment, in a while. And point E, we're still also a diastole when the left atrium is going to intersect with the left ventricle curve. This means what? That in the diastole, the blood in the relaxed left atrium is going to fill with blood and causing the pressure in the atrium to exceed than in the newly emptied ventricle. So the pressure is starting, we're still in this phase. The pressure increasing in the atrium. That's where the pressure is increasing in the atrium, just in the beginning of like the early diastole thingy. That the atrium has the blood flowing into it. After point E, now we're moving into the late diastole. Everything's starting to stop and close. All what we started to open all over again in the atrial systole. In the late diastole, it's which the left ventricle is going to expand. Isn't that a new term? Like, we've always known contract and relax. What is expand? We're gonna know now. The left ventricle is going to expand. So to summarize what we've mentioned in the previous phases, what happens is the atria contracts. The AV valves open until they fill the ventricles, of which the ventricles are going to have a higher pressure than the atria, which shuts the AV valves to move out, and the aortic valve is going to open as a result, pushing the blood out. And this is where the diastole starts and the ventricle is relaxed, and the blood starts to fill the atrium. The pressure starts increasing in the atria. Again, the pressure is increasing as more blood is filled, and the pressure is more than the newly emptied ventricle. Okay, it's where the aortic valve closes too. And then early diastole starts with the ventricle is remaining relaxed, and the atrium fills with blood. The AV valve is gonna open. Then we have late diastole. I hope you guys got what we've been studying. And the left ventricle here expands due to the relaxing muscles. The muscles are very relaxed that it's gonna expand further and further. Do you get what I mean? It's gonna expand even more because the muscles are relaxed. And this is gonna increase the internal volume. You know, when you expand something, you were like that, and then you starting to increase and expand. That's what happens. It's gonna expand as nothing is pushing it into each other. It's not forced anymore to be in this shape. So it's gonna increase, and the volume not only expand and relaxation due to the muscles, the volume also is starting to increase. Alright? And decreases the ventricular pressure, of course. When the volume increases, the pressure decreases. This is a completely physics rule. At the same time, blood is flowing slowly through the newly opened AV valve into the left ventricle. Did you get what's happening? It's like the diastole phase is almost a recap to what happens in the ventricular systole and the atrial systole too. Like now, the atria was starting to fill up and its pressure is getting to increase, and then the AV valve opens and it's moving through the ventricle all over again. Isn't that weird? That was just happening between these two phases. It's about you understand the topic once, and you're not going to forget it. It happens twice in the same exact phase. We hear the pressure in both the atrium and ventricle then increases slowly as they continue to fill with blood. The pressure in both of them is going to increase. This is the finale of the whole movie that's going on. Like the atrium and ventricles are finally gonna both increase slowly, and they'll continue to fill with blood again. Thank you guys for watching. I hope I made this clearer for you.